When David Chun first walked down the main street of Grytviken, a silver mining village in the Colorado Rockies that had been abandoned since 1952, he stopped at the threshold of the old general store and noticed that the dust on the floor still held the impression of the last person to walk there, a set of footprints leading to the counter and stopping, as if someone had simply vanished mid-transaction 70 years ago. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. David was a photographer and what he called an abandonment documentarian, someone who sought out and photographed places that humans had left behind, trying to capture not just the decay and emptiness, but something more elusive, the presence of absence, the particular quality that places have when human life has departed, but the structures and objects remain, creating a kind of frozen moment between occupation and complete dissolution. He'd been photographing abandoned places for 8 years, ever since a personal crisis had led him to quit his job in corporate communications in San Francisco and dedicate himself to what felt like more meaningful work. That crisis, the ending of his marriage, the death of his father, a general sense of having spent his 30s pursuing goals that no longer seemed important, had reoriented his life entirely. At 42, he'd sold the condo, given his ex-wife more than she'd asked for in the settlement, and bought a converted van that served as both transportation and mobile studio. Since then, he'd traveled constantly, seeking out abandoned places across North America, ghost towns in Nevada and Montana, defunct mental hospitals in upstate New York, closed prisons in Pennsylvania, deserted theme parks in Ohio, factory complexes in Detroit where nature was slowly reclaiming what industry had built. Each place had its own story, its own particular quality of abandonment, its own way of holding time. But it was the village's complete small communities that had been left behind, where you could still see the outlines of ordinary life that affected him most deeply. Something about walking through an abandoned village, seeing houses still furnished, stores still stocked, schools with books still on the desks, touched something in him that the larger abandoned structures didn't. These were places where life had been lived fully and then simply stopped, where the rhythms of daily existence had been interrupted and never resumed. Grytviken had been one of those mining towns that sprang up overnight when silver was discovered in the 1870s, and that died almost as quickly when the mines played out in the early 1950s. At its peak, in the 1890s, it had housed about 800 people miners and their families, shopkeepers, saloon operators, a doctor, a teacher, all the necessary components of a functional small town. But as the silver ran out and mining became less profitable, people began to leave. The final mine closed in 1951, and by 1952, the remaining residents had departed, most moving to Denver or other growing cities where work was available. What made Grytviken unusual was how completely it had been abandoned. In many ghost towns, people had taken their possessions when they left, had stripped the buildings of anything valuable or portable. But in Grytviken, for reasons David hadn't yet fully understood, much had been left behind. Furniture remained in houses. Merchandise still sat on store shelves. The schoolhouse had desks and books and a chalkboard with lessons still faintly visible. It was as if the town had been placed under a spell, frozen at the moment of abandonment, preserved by the dry mountain air and by the remoteness that made vandalism and scavenging less likely than in more accessible locations. Grytviken was 7 miles up a rough dirt road from the nearest paved highway, at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet, surrounded by national forest land that limited development and protected the site from casual intrusion. David had obtained permission from the Forest Service to spend a week documenting Grytviken, camping in his van at the edge of the town site, working during the long June days when light lasted until nearly 9 in the evening. He'd arrived 2 days ago and had been systematically photographing the buildings, starting with exterior shots that established the town's layout and geography, then moving to interior documentation that captured the strange intimacy of abandoned domestic spaces. The footprints in the general store had stopped him because they were so specific, so human. The dust was thick decades of accumulation, but the impressions were still clear. A man's boot prints, probably size 10 or 11, work boots with a distinctive tread pattern. The person had entered through the front door, had walked to the counter, had stood there for a moment. The prints showed a slight shifting of weight, and had then, the prints ended. There was no corresponding set of footprints leading back to the door. David knew the rational explanation. The person had left, of course, but had stepped in their own footprints going out, or had taken a different route, or the dust had simply settled differently. Dust was tricky, held impressions unpredictably. But standing there in the dim light filtering through the store's grimy windows, looking at those footprints that seemed to vanish, David felt the eerie quality that abandoned places sometimes had, the sense that something had happened here, some story had unfolded, and the physical evidence remained, but the meaning was lost. He photographed the footprints carefully, multiple angles, capturing the way the light raked across the dust and made the impressions visible. Then he moved deeper into the store, documenting what remained. The shelves still held merchandise, though much of it had deteriorated. Canned goods with labels faded or fallen off, bolts of fabric moth-eaten and dusty, a display of work gloves stiff with age, the counter where someone had once conducted transactions, a heavy wooden structure with a brass cash register that had been left behind, unusual, as cash registers were valuable and portable. David opened it, careful with the stiff mechanism. Empty, of course. No one leaves money behind. Behind the counter was a small office area, and here David found something that made him pause. A ledger book, lying open on a desk, the last entries dated March 1952. The handwriting was clear, careful, recording sales and credit extended to various residents. The last entry read, J. Morrison, tobacco and coffee, $1.25, paid in cash, dated March 17, 1952. David photographed the ledger, then carefully examined the desk. There were other papers, invoices, correspondence, a calendar still turned to March 1952, and there was a half-finished letter, the ink faded but still legible. Dear Sarah, I hope this finds you well in Denver. Things are winding down here faster than I expected. The consolidated mine closed last week, and most of the remaining families are making plans to leave. I've decided to stay through the end of March to close out the store properly, settle accounts, make sure everything is done right. It feels important to end things properly, even if there's no one left to see it. Will join you by April 10th at the latest. Your devoted husband, Robert. The letter was unfinished, unsigned, never sent. What had happened? Had Robert changed his plans, left earlier than intended? Had some emergency called him away before he could finish the letter? Or had something else occurred, something that had prevented the letter's completion? David would never know. This was the nature of abandoned places. They offered fragments, hints, partial stories that could never be fully reconstructed. The letter writer had been real, had sat at this desk in March 1952, had written these words. But what happened next was lost to time, knowable only to the person who'd lived it. He photographed the letter, the desk, the entire office area, trying to capture not just the objects, but the atmosphere, the particular quality of this frozen moment. Then he left the store and continued his documentation, moving to the next building. The pattern repeated throughout the day. Each structure revealed its own abandoned narrative pieces of lives interrupted and never resumed. In one house he found a kitchen with dishes still in the sink, as if someone had eaten breakfast, set the dishes to soak, and never returned. In another, a bedroom with clothing hanging in a wardrobe, shoes lined up beneath, personal effects on a dresser, a brush with hair still caught in the bristles, a photograph of a young couple, a small jewelry box containing a tarnished locket. Why had these things been left? The clothing might have been worn out or out of style, not worth transporting. But the photograph, the locket, these were personal items, things that should have had sentimental value. Yet they'd been abandoned, suggesting either that the departure had been hurried or that the leaving had been so complete, so much a rejection of the past life, that even personal mementos weren't worth keeping. As afternoon moved toward evening, David worked his way to the schoolhouse, a substantial wooden building that stood on a slight rise at the edge of town. The school was larger than he'd expected. 2 rooms, one for younger children, one for older, with a small cloakroom between them and a modest teacherage attached, where the school teacher had presumably lived. The school was remarkably preserved, perhaps because its solid construction and slightly elevated position had protected it from the worst weather. David entered through the front door, which hung slightly ajar, and found himself in a space that seemed almost ready to receive students. The desks were arranged in rows, small wooden desks with attached seats, each one bearing the carved initials and doodles of long-ago students. The walls held faded educational posters, multiplication tables, a map of the United States as it had been in the 1940s, the alphabet in careful cursive letters, and on the teacher's desk at the front of the room, a grade book lay open, showing attendance records and test scores for what looked like the spring semester of 1952. David examined it carefully, reading the names of children who would now be in their 70s and 80s if they were still alive. Patricia Morrison, James Kowalski, Maria Hernandez, Tommy Chun. The last name made him pause, Chun being his own surname, though surely it was coincidence, a common enough name even in 1952. The grade book showed these children's daily presence until March 19, 1952, and then the entries simply stopped. No notation of school closing, no final marks recorded. Just an abrupt ending, as if the teacher had set down their pen mid-semester and never returned. David photographed the grade book, the classroom, the educational posters, trying to capture the ghostly presence of all those vanished children, all those ordinary school days that had once filled this space with noise and energy and life. He tried to imagine it 20 or 30 children at these desks, reciting lessons, passing notes, staring out the windows at the mountains surrounding the town, dreaming of futures that would take them far from this place. Where were they now, those children? They'd be elderly if they'd lived this long, scattered probably, having built lives in other places, carrying memories of Grytviken that had gradually faded into the general accumulation of childhood recollections. Did they ever think of this school, this town, this moment when their ordinary lives had been interrupted by economic forces beyond their comprehension, and they'd been transported to new places, new schools, new futures? In the teacherage, David found more personal traces. A small bedroom with a narrow bed still made up, though the sheets were yellowed and moth-eaten. A sitting room with a bookshelf holding worn copies of novels and poetry, Willa Cather, Robert Frost, Edna St. Vincent Millay. A tiny kitchen with a wood stove and a few dishes in the cupboard. And on a writing desk in the sitting room, another unfinished letter. Dear Mother, I write to tell you that the school will be closing at the end of this month. There are only 12 students left, and 3 more families have announced they'll be leaving before April. The superintendent has decided it's not viable to keep the school open for so few children, and he's right, though it breaks my heart. I've taught here for 6 years, have watched children grow, have felt like I was doing something important, but everything ends, I suppose. I'll return to Denver by the end of March, and will stay with you while I look for a new position. I hope to find another small school, another place where a teacher can really know her students, can make a real difference. Your loving daughter, Catherine. Catherine. The teacher had been a woman named Catherine, had taught here for 6 years, had loved her work, had left with regret. David imagined her writing this letter in March 1952, preparing to close the school and return to the city, sad but practical, already planning her next steps. He photographed the letter, the teacherage, the sitting room with its bookshelf of well-read volumes. Then, as evening light began to fade and the mountain air grew cold, he returned to his van, made a simple dinner on his camp stove, and sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about what he'd seen. This was what drew him to abandoned places, not just the aesthetic of decay, though he found beauty in weathered wood and peeling paint and the way nature gradually reclaimed what humans had built. What drew him was the human dimension, the traces of lives that had been lived in these places, the stories that could be partially reconstructed from the objects left behind. Grytviken had been a real community. People had built houses here, had opened businesses, had raised children, had fallen in love and married and died. They'd had hopes and plans and daily routines. They'd celebrated holidays and dealt with hardships and experienced all the ordinary extraordinariness of human life. And then, over the course of a few years in the early 1950s, they'd left, had packed up what they could carry and moved on, leaving behind the physical structures but taking with them the actual life of the place. What remained was not the town itself. Not really, not in any living sense, but its shadow, its echo, its physical footprint that gestured toward what had been, without being able to fully convey it. David's photographs were attempts to capture this quality, to document not just what was there, but what had been there, to make visible the layers of time and use and ultimate abandonment that gave places like Grytviken their particular power. He thought about the footprints in the general store, the unfinished letters, the grade book with its abrupt ending. Each was a small mystery, a narrative interrupted, a story that could never be completely known. And yet there was something in these incompletions that felt true to human experience generally. Weren't all lives, in some sense, interrupted narratives, stories that ended before they felt finished? His own life certainly felt that way sometimes. The marriage that had ended, the career he'd walked away from, the father he'd lost before they'd resolved certain tensions between them, all were stories that felt incomplete, that lacked the neat resolution that stories were supposed to have. Perhaps that was why he was drawn to abandoned places, to these physical manifestations of incompletion. They mirrored something in his own experience, gave him a way to think about endings that weren't really endings, but just stoppings. Over the following days, David continued his systematic documentation of Grytviken, working through the remaining buildings, photographing exteriors and interiors, trying to capture the full scope of the town as it existed now, 70 years after abandonment. He photographed the church, a simple wooden structure with a bell tower, had beautiful stained glass windows that had somehow survived intact, their colors still vivid when sunlight came through them. He photographed the saloon with its long bar and back bar mirror, and the surprising number of bottles still on the shelves, though empty now of their contents. He photographed the doctor's office, with its examination table and glass-fronted cabinets, still holding medical instruments and bottles of medicines, their labels faded, but still partially readable. And he photographed the cemetery, which stood on a hill outside the main town site, surrounded by a wrought iron fence that had mostly collapsed. The cemetery was small, perhaps 50 graves, but it held multiple generations. The earliest headstones dated to the 1870s, marking the graves of miners who died in the town's first years, some from mining accidents, others from diseases that swept through the crowded settlement. The most recent graves were from the 1940s, a child who died at age 7 in 1943, an elderly man in 1947, a woman in childbirth in 1948. David walked among the graves, photographing the headstones, reading the names and dates, and the occasional epitaph, beloved wife and mother, gone but not forgotten, at rest. The conventional phrases that people use to mark loss, to acknowledge that someone who had mattered was now gone, that their absence registered in the world. He thought about the people buried here, about how they'd stayed even when the living left, about how the cemetery was now the most permanent thing about Grytviken. The buildings would eventually collapse, would be reclaimed completely by nature or by weather. But the graves would remain, these stone markers insisting that people had lived here, had died here, had been mourned here, even after all other evidence of the town's existence had disappeared. As he photographed, David noticed something that had been easy to miss on his first pass through the cemetery. A small section of unmarked graves, just wooden crosses or simple stones with no inscriptions, set apart from the main burial area. These were the graves of the unknown, the unclaimed, the people who died without family or with family too poor to afford proper markers. He counted 7 unmarked graves in this section, each distinguished only by a weathered wooden cross or a rough stone. Who were these people? How had they lived? How had they died? How had they come to be buried in this remote mountain cemetery without anyone to mark their names or dates, to preserve even the basic facts of their existence? David photographed the unmarked graves, feeling the weight of this anonymity, this erasure. The other graves, with their names and dates, preserved at least the basic information of a life when it began, when it ended, whose child or spouse or parent this person had been. But these unmarked graves held people who were completely lost, whose names and stories had vanished, who existed now only as physical presences under the ground, their individual identities erased by time and circumstance. He thought about his photography, about his work documenting abandoned places, and wondered if it was, in some sense, an attempt to resist this kind of erasure. By photographing Grytviken, by carefully documenting the traces of lives lived here, wasn't he trying to preserve something to insist that what had happened here mattered? That the people who'd lived and worked and raised families in this place deserved to be remembered even if only through the physical evidence they'd left behind? On his 5th day in Grytviken, David decided to explore beyond the main town site, to see if there were other structures further out, miners' cabins, perhaps, or remnants of the actual mining operations. He'd packed his camera equipment in some water and set out, following what had once been a road, but was now just a faint track through the forest that had grown up around the town's edges. About a mile from the main town site, he found what he'd been looking for, a cluster of small cabins, more primitive than the houses in town, that had probably housed miners who'd worked the more remote claims. The cabins were in worse condition than the town buildings, having been built more hastily and with less substantial materials, but several were still standing, their log walls weathered but intact. David explored these cabins one by one, photographing their interiors, finding the minimal evidence of the lives lived here, a rusted bed frame, a broken chair, pieces of a cook stove. These had been working men's shelters, places to sleep and eat between shifts in the mines, not homes in any comfortable sense. In one cabin, though, he found something unexpected, a collection of books, perhaps 20 volumes, stacked on a crude shelf built into the wall. The books were water-damaged and mostly illegible, but David carefully examined them, trying to determine what they were. Poetry, he realized, volumes of Whitman, Longfellow, Tennyson, Byron. Someone who'd lived in this rough cabin had owned a collection of poetry. Had read it, the books showed signs of use, of being handled and opened repeatedly. The image this created, a miner coming home exhausted from underground labor, lighting a lamp in this primitive cabin, and reading poetry, struck David as both improbable and deeply moving. It complicated his understanding of who these miners had been, what their inner lives might have been like, reminded him that people were never just one thing, that even the roughest circumstances could contain spaces of beauty and reflection. He photographed the books carefully, then continued his exploration, finding more cabins, more fragments of lives. In one, a wall calendar from 1951, frozen at October. In another, a photograph nailed to the wall, a young couple, formally dressed, the photograph so faded and water-damaged that their faces were barely visible, but their pose, suggesting a wedding portrait or anniversary photo. By afternoon, David had reached the mining area itself, several shaft openings, sealed with heavy timbers, and "Danger, do not enter" signs, that had been placed by the Forest Service when the area was incorporated into federal land. He photographed the sealed shafts, the rusted mining equipment scattered around the area, the waste rock piles that marked where ore had been processed. This was the reason for Grytviken's existence, the silver that had been in these mountains, that had drawn people here, that had created the town, and ultimately abandoned it when the deposits played out. The mine shafts were empty now, the silver extracted and gone, and the town that had grown around them was empty too, a consequence following inevitably from a cause that had been exhausted. Standing there in the afternoon sunlight, looking at the sealed mine entrances and the ruined equipment, David thought about the economics of abandonment, about how places like Grytviken were created by specific economic circumstances, and ended when those circumstances changed. These ghost towns were, in a sense, monuments to capitalism's dynamism, the way it could create communities overnight when profit was available and abandon them just as quickly when profit dried up. But they were also monuments to something more human and more sad, the way people's lives and hopes and communities could be treated as disposable, as temporary arrangements that could be dismantled when they were no longer economically productive. The people of Grytviken hadn't wanted to leave, hadn't chosen abandonment. They'd been forced out by circumstances beyond their control, by the simple fact that there was no longer a way to make a living here. Where had they gone, those 800 people? Denver, probably, or other growing cities. Some might have prospered in their new locations, might have built better lives than they'd had in Grytviken. But others probably struggled, probably missed the community they'd left, probably felt displaced and disconnected in ways that their children and grandchildren might still carry, might still feel in subtle ways they couldn't fully articulate. As David walked back toward the main town site, his mind was full of these thoughts, these attempts to understand not just what he was photographing, but what it meant, what it said about how humans lived and built and left behind. He was so absorbed in thought that he almost didn't notice the figure ahead of him on the path. But then he did notice, and he stopped abruptly. A man stood perhaps 50 feet ahead on the path David was walking, wearing what looked like work clothes, denim jeans, a flannel shirt, work boots. The man was looking away toward the town, and he was utterly still in a way that made David's scalp prickle with unease. "Hello?" David called out, his voice sounding strange in the mountain quiet. The figure didn't respond, didn't turn, didn't move. David took a few steps closer, called out again. Still no response. And then, as David watched, the figure simply faded, becoming translucent, and then was gone. Not walking away, not moving into the trees, but fading like mist dissipating in sunlight, until there was nothing there at all. David stood frozen, his heart hammering, his rational mind trying to process what he'd just seen. An optical illusion, obviously. The light playing tricks, a shadow cast by trees, something his tired eyes had misinterpreted. There was no such thing as ghosts. He didn't believe in ghosts. He'd explored dozens of abandoned places and had never seen anything that couldn't be rationally explained. But he had seen something, or thought he had. The figure had been clear, solid-looking, unmistakably a person, and then it hadn't been. David waited for several minutes, watching the spot where the figure had stood, but nothing reappeared, nothing moved. Eventually he forced himself to continue walking, moving past the spot where the figure had been, half expecting something to happen, but finding only the ordinary path, the ordinary trees, the ordinary afternoon light filtering through the forest. He didn't tell himself he'd seen a ghost. He told himself he'd been tired, that the altitude sometimes caused hallucinations, that his mind had been full of thoughts about the dead, and that he'd projected something onto a shadow or a trick of light. But underneath these rational explanations, something less certain remained. A small uncomfortable feeling that he'd witnessed something he didn't understand, something that didn't fit into his materialist worldview. That evening, back at his van, David went through the photographs he'd taken that day, examining them on his laptop, checking exposures and composition. And in one image, a shot of the path taken just before he'd seen the figure, there was something. A blur, a suggestion of form, in the approximate location where the man had stood. Not clear enough to be definitive, easily dismissible as motion blur or a camera glitch, but there nonetheless. David stared at the image for a long time, trying to decide what he thought, what he believed. He'd always been a skeptic about paranormal claims, had dismissed ghost stories as wishful thinking or attention-seeking or misinterpretation of natural phenomena. But now, having had his own experience, he found his certainty shaken. Maybe there was something to the old stories about ghosts, about spirits lingering in places they'd lived or died, about the dead not being as completely gone as we like to think. Or maybe, and this felt closer to what David actually believed, maybe some places held memories in ways that were almost physical, that strong emotions or dramatic events or simply the accumulation of many lives could create a kind of psychic residue that sensitive people could pick up on. He didn't know, but he saved the photograph with the blur, labeled it carefully, added it to his Grytviken documentation. Evidence of something even if he wasn't sure what. His final 2 days in Grytviken, David found himself more alert to unusual experiences, more open to the possibility that something beyond the ordinary was present in this place. He didn't see any more figures, didn't have any more clear experiences of the anomalous, but he felt watched sometimes, felt a presence that he couldn't locate or define, felt that the town was not as empty as it appeared. Maybe this was just his imagination, primed by the earlier experience to find significance in ordinary sensations. Or maybe there really was something here, some residue of all the lives that had been lived in this place, some echo of the community that had existed for 70 years and then vanished, but which had left behind more than just physical structures. On his last evening, David walked through the town one final time, saying a kind of goodbye, acknowledging the privilege of having spent this week here, of having been trusted with documenting what remained. He walked down the main street in the golden light of late afternoon, past the general store with its mysterious footprints, past the houses with their abandoned personal effects, past the school with its grade books and unfinished lessons. And he walked to the cemetery, stood among the graves, read the names one more time. Patricia Morrison, James Kowalski, Maria Hernandez, Tommy Chun, the teacher Catherine, whose last name he'd never learned. Robert, who'd written to his wife Sarah in Denver and never finished the letter. All the known and unknown dead, buried in this mountain cemetery, their graves marking the only permanent human presence left in Grytviken. "I see you," David said aloud, speaking to the dead, to the ghosts, literal or metaphorical, to the memory of the community that had been. "I see you, and I'll tell your story, as much of it as I can tell. You won't be completely forgotten." It was a promise he made to every place he photographed, a recognition that his work was not just aesthetic but ethical, that documenting abandonment was a form of bearing witness, of insisting that what had been still mattered, even in its absence. The next morning, David packed up his van and drove slowly down the rough road that led away from Grytviken, watching the town recede in his mirrors, the buildings growing smaller, and then disappearing behind the trees and the curves of the mountain road. He felt the usual mixture of satisfaction and sadness that came at the end of a documentation project, satisfaction that he'd done the work well, sadness that it was over, that he was leaving this place that he'd come to know intimately over the week. He drove to Denver, checked into a cheap hotel, and spent the next week processing the photographs, selecting the best images, editing them carefully to bring out the particular qualities he wanted to emphasize: the texture of weathered wood, the way light fell through broken windows, the accumulated dust that held traces of disappeared lives. The Grytviken series would become one of his most acclaimed, would be exhibited in galleries in New York and Los Angeles, would be published in a beautiful book that received respectful reviews and modest sales. People would respond to the images, would feel the same pull that David felt toward abandoned places, the combination of aesthetic beauty and human poignancy that made these photographs more than just documentation of decay. But for David, the real significance was more personal and harder to articulate. Photographing Grytviken had been another step in his ongoing attempt to understand something about endings, about loss, about what remained when what mattered most had gone. The town was dead, its community scattered or gone entirely. But the place still existed, still held evidence of what had been, still gestured toward stories and lives that deserved attention even in their incompleteness. Several months after leaving Grytviken, David received an unexpected email. It was from a woman named Helen Chun Morrison, who'd seen his photographs online and recognized the name of the town. Her grandmother, Patricia Morrison, had been born in Grytviken in 1940 and had lived there until the town closed in 1952. Helen wrote that her grandmother, now 83 years old, had seen David's photographs and had been deeply moved, had cried seeing images of the school she'd attended, the house where she'd lived, the cemetery where her infant brother was buried. Would David, Helen asked, be willing to speak with her grandmother? Patricia had stories about Grytviken, memories that she'd been carrying for more than 70 years, and seeing the photographs had awakened a desire to share them, to tell someone who'd been there, who'd seen the place, and would understand what it had meant. David agreed immediately, and a few days later found himself on a video call with Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 80s who spoke with remarkable clarity about her childhood in the mountain mining town. She told him about her father, who'd worked in the consolidated mine, who'd come home exhausted and dust-covered, but who'd always made time to play with his children in the evenings. She told him about her mother, who'd taught piano to the town's children in their small living room, who'd organized holiday celebrations and church socials, who'd tried to create culture and beauty in the rough mining environment. She told him about school, about the teacher, Miss Catherine, who'd encouraged Patricia's love of reading, who'd given her books to take home, who'd believed Patricia could have a future beyond Grytviken, even when the town itself seemed like the entire world. She told him about friends, Maria and Tommy and James, whose names David remembered from the grade book, about playing in the mountains during the summers, about ice skating on the pond in winter, about the particular closeness that developed in small communities where everyone knew everyone else. And she told him about leaving, about how sudden it had been, how her father had come home in March 1952 and announced that the mine was closing, that they'd be moving to Denver in 2 weeks, that everything was changing. She remembered packing, trying to decide what to take and what to leave, remembered saying goodbye to friends who were also leaving. Everyone scattering to different cities, different futures. The hardest part, Patricia said, her elderly face on the video screen showing the weight of this memory, was that we never went back. Not once. It was too far, too hard to get to. And after a few years it felt like going back would be more painful than just remembering. But I've always wondered what happened to it, if anything was left, if the place I remembered so vividly actually existed, or if it was just my imagination, making it more significant that it really was. "It's real," David told her. "The place is real. Your house is still there, the school is still there, the cemetery where your brother is buried is still there. It's all real." Patricia cried then, quietly, and David waited, understanding that this was important, that his photographs had given her something she needed, proof that her memories corresponded to physical reality, that the place that had shaped her childhood still existed in some form, that her connection to it was valid and could be acknowledged. They talked for more than an hour, Patricia sharing memories and David describing what he'd found, what he'd photographed, answering her questions about specific places and details. He told her about the footprints in the general store, the unfinished letter from Robert to Sarah, the grade book with its abrupt ending in March 1952. "That was Miss Catherine's handwriting," Patricia said, when David described the grade book. "I'd know it anywhere. She had the most beautiful handwriting, perfect cursive. We all tried to copy it. Do you know what happened to her? To Miss Catherine? She went back to Denver, taught at a city school for a few more years, then married and stopped teaching. I lost touch with her, but I heard she had a good life. I hope she did. She deserved happiness." Patricia paused. "Did you go to the cemetery? Did you see my brother's grave?" David had to tell her that he'd seen the cemetery but hadn't noted individual names, hadn't realized he was looking for anyone specific. But he promised to send her all his cemetery photographs so she could identify her brother's grave, could see that it was still there, still marked, still acknowledging his brief life. After the call ended, David sat quietly, processing what had been shared. Patricia's memories had animated his photographs in new ways, had given them depth and specificity they couldn't have had on their own. Her stories connected the empty buildings to actual lives, to specific people with names and personalities and experiences, to a real community rather than just an abstract ghost town. This, David realized, was what his work needed, not to replace the photographs, but to supplement them, to provide context and human detail that images alone couldn't convey. He began reaching out to other Grytviken survivors, using genealogy databases and local historical societies to find people who'd lived in the town, who had memories and stories to share. Over the following months, he conducted interviews with a dozen former Grytviken residents, ranging in age from late 70s to early 90s. Each person shared their own memories, their own version of what life had been like in the mountain mining town, their own experiences of leaving and building new lives elsewhere. Some patterns emerged. Most people remembered Grytviken fondly, acknowledging its hardships but emphasizing the community's closeness, the beauty of the mountain setting, the particular quality of life in a small, isolated town where everyone knew everyone else. Most had been glad to leave at the time the town was dying. Opportunities were elsewhere. The future clearly lay in the cities. But most also carried some nostalgia, some sense that something valuable had been lost when the community scattered, that the connections formed in Grytviken had been deeper than the connections they'd found in their subsequent lives. Several people mentioned the phenomenon of returning in dreams, of finding themselves back in Grytviken in sleep, walking the old streets, seeing people long dead, experiencing the town as it had been in their childhood. These dreams were vivid, detailed, emotionally powerful, and they persisted across decades. One man, now 86, said he'd dreamed of Grytviken at least once a month for his entire adult life, that the town was more present in his dream life than many of the places he'd actually lived. David found this fascinating, The way a place from childhood could maintain such a hold on the imagination, could persist in memory and dream more powerfully than subsequent experiences, could remain a kind of psychological touchstone across 7 decades of life. It suggested something about how place shapes identity, about how the landscapes of childhood become interior landscapes that we carry our entire lives. He began to incorporate these stories and memories into his Grytviken project, creating a multimedia presentation that combined photographs with audio of the interviews, with text excerpts from the memories people had shared. The result was something richer than his previous work, something that captured not just the empty town but the living community it had been, the people who'd inhabited it, the specific texture of life that had been lived there. The expanded project was exhibited at a museum in Denver, and the opening was attended by several of the Grytviken survivors, including Patricia Morrison and her family. David watched as these elderly people walked through the gallery, looking at photographs of the place they'd left 70 years ago, crying sometimes, laughing sometimes, sharing memories with each other, reconnecting after decades of separation. Patricia stood for a long time in front of David's photograph of the schoolhouse, her hand reaching out to almost touch the image. "I can smell it," she said quietly. "The wood smell, the chalk dust, Miss Catherine's perfume. It's all right there, even though I know intellectually that the photograph can't carry smell. But my memory is filling in what the image suggests, and it's so vivid I could swear I'm actually there." This was what David had been trying to achieve, not just documentation, but evocation, the creation of images that could trigger memory, that could connect past and present, that could make the absent at least temporarily present through the alchemy of photography and remembrance. After the exhibition, David continued his work documenting abandoned places, but with a new dimension to his practice. He sought out not just the places themselves, but the people who left them, who carried memories of what had been. He conducted interviews, collected oral histories, created multimedia projects that combined images with stories, with testimony, with the voices of people who'd lived in the places he photographed. This work was slower, more complex, required skills beyond photography, interviewing, historical research, audio editing, but it felt more complete, more true to what David was actually trying to do, which was not just to document abandonment, but to resist forgetting, to insist that the places and people that had been pushed to the margins of history and memory still mattered, still deserved attention and acknowledgement. He returned to Grytviken several more times over the following years, documenting how the town changed or didn't change as more seasons passed. Some buildings collapsed, finally succumbing to weather and time. Trees grew larger, reclaiming more of the town site. The cemetery fence fell down completely, but the basic structures remained. The town persisted in its abandoned state, a monument to what had been and a puzzle for anyone who stumbled upon it and wondered about its history. On one return visit, 3 years after his initial documentation, David brought Patricia Morrison with him. She'd expressed a desire to see the town one more time before she died, to walk the streets of her childhood, to visit her brother's grave, to close a circle that had been open for 70 years. The journey was difficult. Patricia was 86 now, not as mobile as she'd once been, and the rough road into Grytviken was challenging even in David's 4-wheel drive vehicle. But she insisted, and David drove slowly, carefully, making the 7-mile journey from the highway to the town site with Patricia in the passenger seat, silent, watching the familiar landscape appear as they climbed higher into the mountains. When they arrived, Patricia wept. David helped her out of the vehicle, and she stood in the main street, looking around at the buildings, the mountains, the particular quality of light at this elevation. "It's smaller," she said. "Everything's smaller than I remembered. But it's also exactly the same, somehow. The feel of it, the atmosphere, that's exactly as I remember." They walked slowly through the town, David supporting Patricia's arm, Patricia directing their route, wanting to see specific places, specific buildings. Her childhood home first, a small house on the edge of town that she identified immediately, despite its decay. They stood in the doorway looking at the interior, Patricia describing where furniture had been, where she'd slept, what the view from her bedroom window had looked like. "I was happy here," she said, "not because it was easy or perfect, but because I was loved, because I belonged, because the world made sense in a way it hasn't always made sense. That's what I've missed, I think. Not the place itself, exactly, but the feeling of belonging that I had here, the certainty of my place in a community that knew me." They visited the school, Patricia standing in the classroom where she'd learned to read and write, where Miss Catherine had taught her that the world was larger than this, Mountain Valley, and that she could be part of that larger world if she worked hard and believed in herself. Patricia touched the teacher's desk, the blackboard, the windowsill where she'd sat and looked out at the mountains during lessons. And finally, they visited the cemetery, walking slowly up the hill to the fenced area where Patricia's infant brother was buried. She'd been 4 years old when he died, had only the dimmest memories of him, but his death had been a defining loss in her family, something her parents never quite recovered from. The grave was there, marked with a small headstone that read Thomas Morrison, 1943, infant son, forever in our hearts. Patricia knelt beside the grave, her elderly body moving carefully, and she placed a hand on the headstone. "Hello, Tommy," she said quietly. "I'm sorry I haven't visited. I'm sorry it took me so long to come back. But I never forgot you. Mom and Dad never forgot you. You were part of us, always." She stayed kneeling there for several minutes, David standing back, giving her privacy, photographing only with permission, documenting this moment of return and reunion and closure. When Patricia finally stood, David helped her up, and they walked slowly back down the hill toward the vehicle. "Thank you," Patricia said as they drove away from Grytviken for what would be the last time she died 8 months later, peacefully having made her peace with the place that had shaped her. "Thank you for showing me that it was real, that my memories corresponded to something that actually existed. It matters more than I can say." David understood what she meant. We all need to know that our memories are real, that the places and people and experiences that shaped us actually existed outside our own minds, that we're not making it all up or projecting significance onto things that were actually ordinary or meaningless. Patricia had needed to know that Grytviken was real, that her childhood there had been real, that the community she remembered with such fondness had actually existed, and not just in her imagination. And David had been able to give her that confirmation through his photographs and through his willingness to take her back to the place itself. This felt like the most meaningful work he'd ever done, not the photographs themselves, impressive as they might be, but the act of connection they'd enabled, the closure they'd facilitated, the acknowledgement they'd provided that a life, a place, a community mattered and deserved to be remembered. Over the years that followed, David continued his work documenting abandoned places, but Grytviken remained his touchstone, the project that defined what he was trying to do and why it mattered. He returned to the town occasionally, documenting its ongoing decay, noting how each building changed over time, how nature gradually reclaimed what humans had built. And he thought about the footprints in the general store, the mystery that had captured his attention on his first day in Grytviken. He never solved it, never discovered whose footprints they were or why they seemed to end without continuation. But he came to understand that the mystery itself was the point, that abandoned places were full of such mysteries, such questions without answers, such fragments of stories that could never be completed. The work was not to solve these mysteries, but to acknowledge them, to document them, to insist that they mattered even in their incompleteness. Every abandoned place held thousands of such mysteries, individual decisions and experiences and moments that were lost to time but which had been real, which had mattered to the people who lived them, which deserved acknowledgement even if they could never be fully reconstructed. Walking through empty halls, photographing dust and decay and the scattered remains of interrupted lives, David was performing an act of memorial, of remembrance, of resistance against forgetting. The places he documented were dying, yes, would eventually be gone completely, reclaimed by nature or destroyed by weather, or simply vanishing as the materials that formed them decomposed. But his photographs would remain, his interviews would remain, his documentation would remain. And future generations could look at them and see not just empty buildings, but evidence of lives lived, of communities built, of human presence in places that were now empty, but which had once been full of noise and activity and the ordinary, extraordinariness of people living their lives. This was the work, not to prevent abandonment or to restore what had been lost, but to ensure that what had been was acknowledged, was remembered, was given the respect and attention that human endeavor deserved even in failure, even in ending, even in the dust and decay of places where no one lived anymore, but where the footprints of previous inhabitants could still, if you looked carefully, be found. David Chun continued this work for the rest of his life, photographing abandoned villages, interviewing survivors, documenting the places that capitalism and history and simple change had left behind. The work never felt finished. There were always more places, more stories, more people whose memories deserved recording. But Grytviken remained the heart of it, the place that had taught him most clearly what he was doing and why. When he was older, when his own life was drawing toward its close, he requested that some of his ashes be scattered in the Grytviken cemetery among the graves of people he'd never met, but whose lives he'd spent years trying to honor and document. His request was fulfilled. And so David Chun, the photographer who dedicated his life to documenting abandonment, became part of one of the places he documented, his ashes mingling with the dust of a mountain mining town that had died 70 years before he'd arrived, but which had, through his work, been given a kind of afterlife, a continued presence in human memory, and attention that kept it from being completely forgotten. The footprints in dust, the unfinished letters, the grayed books with abrupt endings, the photographs on walls in empty houses, all remained, gradually fading, gradually being reclaimed by time and nature, but preserved in David's photographs and his interviews, in the archive he'd created that insisted these places and the people who'd inhabited them mattered, deserved remembrance, were part of the human story even in their abandonment. And anyone who looked at his work, anyone who walked through the galleries where his photographs hung, or paged through the books he'd published or listened to the oral histories he'd collected, could see what David had seen, that abandoned places were not just sites of decay, but monuments to human endeavor, to the persistent attempt to build and create and live meaningfully even in places and circumstances that were temporary, that would eventually end, that were always haunted by the knowledge of their own impermanence. This was the truth that Grytviken had taught him, that all the abandoned places had taught him, that we build knowing we will leave, that we create knowing it will decay, that we live knowing we will die. But we build and create and live anyway, leaving behind footprints in dust, evidence that we were here, that we mattered, that our presence in the world registered even if only temporarily, even if only in the traces that the patient photographer could find and document and insist deserve to be remembered. The last candle burns, the footprints fade, the abandoned villages slowly collapse and return to the earth from which they came. But the memory persists, carried forward by those who care enough to document, to witness, to insist that what was still matters, still deserves attention, still connects to the present through the invisible threads of human continuity, human care, human refusal to let the forgotten stay forgotten. David's photographs were not just images of empty buildings. They were arguments against erasure, insistences on memory, acts of love directed toward places and people that most of the world had moved past and forgotten. They said, "You were here, you built this, you lived and worked and raised families and created community. And even though you're gone and your communities are scattered and your buildings are collapsing, you mattered. You still matter. You will be remembered." And in that remembering, in that careful documentation and witness, the abandoned places lived on not as they had been, not in any physical sense, but in the realm of human attention and care, in the archive of memory where everything that has ever mattered continues to matter as long as someone is willing to remember, to look, to document, to insist that the footprints in dust are not just random marks but evidence of human presence, human story, human life that deserves acknowledgement long after the people who left those footprints have vanished into the past.